was his problem. He said he lost those vents and he had a lift, and he said he was holding his own. The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that.
At 7:10 p.m. on November 10th, 1975, the 729-foot ore carrier Edmund Fitzgerald and her crew of 29 disappeared. There was no distress call, no cries for help, just the echoes of the ship's legacy and the hardworking men who went down with her. This is a deep dive into the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. On November 8, 1975, a low-pressure system developed over parts of California, Arizona, and Colorado. As the storm moved east in a counterclockwise direction over the Oklahoma Panhandle, it brought with it cold air from the Rocky Mountains, and also moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, along with warm air from Texas. Subsequently, storm clouds developed, and the National Weather Service predicted rain. By 7 o'clock a.m. the next morning, the southern system was over south-central Kansas and was moving in a more northeasterly direction. Later that day, the National Weather Service would predict a shift to a more northern direction, which set the storm's track over Lake Superior. By evening on the 9th of November, gale warnings would be issued for Lake Superior. It's 8:30 a.m. on November 9th, 1975, and the Edmund Fitzgerald is docked at the Burlington Northern Dock No. 1 in Superior, Wisconsin, loading taconite pellets. The Fitzgerald, often known as the Mighty Fitz or Big Fitz by enthusiasts around the lakes, was a workhorse for her company and looked great doing it. With a gorgeous red and white paint job, a beautiful pilot house, and luxurious guest cabins, the Edmund Fitzgerald was adored by many. But in addition to her beauty, the ship could carry more than 25,000 tons of cargo, and at 729 feet in length, the vessel was still one of the largest sailing on the Great Lakes. In fact, when she was launched, the vessel would be the largest hull to ever hit the water on the Great Lakes, the Queen of the Lakes. The Fitzgerald was laid down as hull number 301 on August 9, 1957, with a price tag of $8.4 million, or just under $97 million when adjusted for inflation. The ship would be under ownership of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance and would be operated by the Columbia Transportation Division of the Ogilvy Norton Company. When completed, the historic vessel would measure 729 feet in length, 75 feet in width, 39 feet in depth, and would be powered by a 7,500 horsepower steam turbine engine that would propel her to speeds of nearly 16.5 miles per hour. She would also be able to carry more than 25,000 tons of cargo per trip. But her construction would be quite interesting. It would differ from the traditional procedure of laying down a vessel's keel and building up from there. Instead, the Fitz would be built in large sections, weighing up to 70 tons, at different parts of the Detroit Engineering Works yard in River Rouge, Michigan. These sections would then be floated to the main construction site, where 2 cranes would be attached to either end and lift the section to its appropriate spot, where welders would connect them to the other sections of the vessel. This method of assembly had only been attempted during the construction of Liberty ships, which were constructed with the fastest possible method in order for the vessels to enter service in a timely manner. As for the Edmund Fitzgerald, her construction would go along fairly smoothly. The naming of the vessel was a different story. The Fitzgerald, or hull number 301 at the time, was owned by Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance, and the president of the company, Mr. Edmund Fitzgerald, had recently stepped down to instead become the chair of the company's board of trustees. So, to honor his years of work and service to the company and the Great Lakes region, the trustees proposed naming the vessel after him. This was not the first time a vessel had been named after someone in the Fitzgerald family, as several other vessels had sailed with a Fitzgerald name, one of which was still in service as the W.E. Fitzgerald. But Edmund Fitzgerald opposed the idea of the new massive vessel being named after him, suggesting several other names such as the Centennial, Seaway, Milwaukee, or Northwestern. Despite his suggestions, the board members would still vote unanimously to name the vessel SS Edmund Fitzgerald. One of the board members would later comment that getting Edmund to agree on the name was of great difficulty. But on June 7, 1958, just 10 months after the construction had started, the Edmund Fitzgerald would be launched. The event was attended by more than 10,000 people watching from the roofs of buildings, the dockside, the grandstands, or on small vessels which lined the Detroit River. The major event was attended by politicians, businessmen, civic leaders, members of the press, the men who had worked to see her finished, and thousands more who wanted to witness this historical event. Mr. Edmund Fitzgerald and his wife Elizabeth Fitzgerald would take their place at the elevated platform next to the ship. After all of the speeches had been delivered, Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzgerald stepped forward to christen the massive vessel. Oddly enough, when she swung the bottle at the stem of the vessel, the bottle didn't break. The second attempt would have the same outcome. But finally, on the third try, the bottle broke, and hull number 301 was officially christened as the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. But those who were superstitious saw the failed attempts to break the bottle as bad luck. The rest of the launch would be even more ominous, though. As the ropes securing the freighter were cut and the Fitzgerald slid down the ramp, she hit the water at an awkward angle, sending a wall of water rushing across the slip, which crashed into the retaining wall and dosed the crowd. The Fitzgerald would roll, then right herself before slamming into the dock at the opposite side of the slip. One of the onlookers, Jennings Fraser, a 58-year-old Toledo man, would suffer a heart attack and sadly pass away. The superstitious saw this as even more evidence of bad luck for the vessel. But despite these signs of bad luck and concerns over the speed of the vessel's assembly, she would perform well on her sea trials, putting away any doubt about the vessel's quality. She was a well-built ship, and had spent the summer months being fitted out with standard equipment, along with elegant living quarters and luxurious guest cabins. In just the forward cabins, there were 2 guest staterooms and a guest lounge featuring simulated leather coverings on the walls, leather chairs, plush furniture, and a large window with a panoramic view of the stern section and the lake. Even the vessel's standard living quarters were more fancy than most at the time. They were air-conditioned and furnished with beds, bookshelves, closets, desks, tiled floors, and for some, even a private shower. The captain's office even boasted a gorgeous walnut desk. The Edmund Fitzgerald was beautiful inside and out, and by the end of summer in 1958, she would be the new flagship for the Columbia Transportation Division. The vessel's maiden voyage on September 22, 1958, would take her to Silver Bay, Minnesota, to load taconite pellets for Toledo, Ohio, a run the vessel would become known for and even earn her the nickname Toledo Express. This very first load would break a tonnage record when she passed through the Soo Locks a few days later. The Fitzgerald would continue breaking tonnage records, in fact, and came to be one of the many things that the vessel was known for. The ship would even break the 30,000-ton mark several times. But by 1975, larger vessels had been built, and the Fitzgerald legacy of breaking records was over. Nevertheless, the vessel remained as one of the largest vessels on the lakes, despite the onslaught of the newer and larger 1,000-footers. Even still, she was known as the pride of the American side. After all, the Fitzgerald was still the company's flagship, and even if other ships could carry more than the vessel, she could still carry above 25,000 tons of cargo. It was near the end of the season for the Edmund Fitzgerald and her crew, and the ship was on one of her last runs. This trip would have her loading 26,116 tons of taconite pellets for delivery at Zug Island in Detroit. But right now, it's 8:30 a.m. on November the 9th of 1975, and the Fitzgerald is still loading her cargo at Superior, Wisconsin's Burlington Northern Dock Number 1. First Mate John McCarthy is supervising the loading, which had gone smoothly up to that point. Loading a vessel the size of the Fitz is no easy task. The Fitzgerald cargo hold measured 500 feet in length and 30 feet in width, and was separated by 3 different sections. The vessel wasn't quickly loaded, and despite the fact it only took mere minutes to transfer the pellets from each pocket through the way of loading chutes into the cargo hold, the overall process was much more time-consuming. First off, the vessel had to remain level during the loading. Uneven distribution of the cargo presented risks of capsizing or stressing the hull. Trim lights on the vessel's stern deckhouse showed if the vessel was listing or not. A red light indicated a list at the port side, a green light indicated a list at the starboard, and a white light meant the ship was level. Draft markings on the sides of the freighter indicated how deep the vessel was settling into the water. Another possible hazard during the loading process was careless positioning of the loading chutes. In this case, hatch coamings could get damaged. If they were damaged, it could allow water to flow into the cargo hold. Despite this, coamings were still commonly banged around by the chutes, but all in all, very little water could enter the hold from this minor damage. The Fitz herself had even suffered minor damage sometime earlier that year, as an inspection by the Coast Guard and American Bureau of Shipping on October 31st of 1975, just 9 days earlier, showed minor damage to 4 of the hatches. These weren't considered serious, and the vessel would be clear to sail the rest of the season, with the understanding that it would be repaired during winter layup. Several seasons prior, on September 9th, 1969, the Edmund Fitzgerald had grounded near the Sioux Locks, resulting in substantial structural damage. During winter layup, several cracks were found at the keelson-to-shell connection. The vessel would be repaired after additional steel stiffeners were added to the keelson. The next year, the vessel would again be damaged after a minor collision with the steamer Hochelaga, resulting in just minor damage. Subsequent to this, the Fitzgerald would strike the locks at Sault Ste. Marie on 3 different occasions, which all only resulted in minor damage. All things considered, the Fitzgerald was in good condition and had even received updates recently. In 1969, the vessel received a diesel-powered bow thruster, allowing for more maneuverability, and during winter layup in 1971 to 1972, the ship was converted from coal burning to oil burning. The ship was as good as any could be, and so was her crew. In fact, the Edmund Fitzgerald was relatively young for Great Lakes standards, as vessels on the lakes can last for up to a century, since fresh water doesn't rust the hull. Now, on November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was on one of her last runs of the season, and soon enough, her crew could go home and see their families. Captain Ernest McSorley was anxious to get back to his wife Nellie, who had recently suffered a stroke and was placed in a nursing home in Toledo. He was even considering retiring at the end of the season. McSorley had sailed in the lakes for many years and been commanding vessels since 1951, when he took the role of captain on the 255-foot freighter Carrollton, becoming the youngest master on the lakes at 38. He was a quiet man and carried himself in a professional manner. Despite his serious nature, those who knew him saw a humorous and fun side to him. Overall, McSorley was spoken highly of by those who worked with him. His first mate and close friend, John McCarthy, was also an experienced mariner. They had met while working on a freighter together and grew close when he worked as first mate on the Armco under Ernest McSorley. When McSorley was given command of the Edmund Fitzgerald, he asked McCarthy if he wanted to join him, and the latter agreed immediately. McCarthy was also Irish and was easygoing and quite humorous. To those who worked with him, he was much nicer than many first mates they had known, who could be quite grumpy. The Fitzgerald's cook, Robert Rafferty, was hoping to make it home soon to spend time with his wife Brooksy, and to make it back in time to see the birth of his grandchild, as his daughter Pam was 8 months pregnant. Rafferty, having served on the lakes for quite some time, had not been able to be there for his 2 kids, and wanted to spend as much time with his grandkids as he could. Rafferty would be retiring when the season was over. For Mike Armagost, his career was still developing, and with any luck he'd have his master's papers eventually. His wife Janice and their 2 kids lived in Iron River, Wisconsin, not far from where the Fitzgerald was loading that day. Mike would be able to spend some time with his family before the Fitzgerald left Superior. The Edmund Fitzgerald, in fact, rarely made this run, and it was her first trip to Superior that season. Normally, the vessel loaded at Silver Bay and unloaded her cargo at Toledo, but today, the 729-foot freighter would be loading 26,116 tons of taconite pellets for Detroit's Sug Island. In years past, this amount of cargo was a large load for that time in the season, when vessels would carry less than what they did in the summer months when the weather was good. But in 1973, changes to the minimum freeboard required allowed the Fitzgerald to carry more cargo. Minimum freeboard refers to the distance between the ship's draft and the vessel's deck, the draft being the distance from their waterline to the vessel's keel. Freeboard is important because it determines how much cargo a vessel can carry without losing buoyancy. Depending on the time of the shipping season, the requirements for a minimum freeboard are different. In the month of November, more freeboard is required to prevent a vessel from being boarded by heavy seas, as storms are quite common in November. The changing of the minimum freeboard requirements in 1973 allowed the Fitzgerald to carry more cargo and sit lower in the water. But this hadn't caused any issues for the Fitzgerald so far. So, the Edmund Fitzgerald would be loaded to a draft of 27 feet and 6 inches at the stern and 27 feet and 2 inches at the bow, and was fueled up with 50,013 gallons of No. 6 fuel. The crew would start fastening down the hatch covers, and the Edmund Fitzgerald would depart the dock at 2:15 p.m. with a crew of 29 and head for the open water of Lake Superior under sunny skies and an unseasonably warm temperature, much different than what the crew would experience in the hours ahead. All mariners on the Great Lakes are familiar with the Witch of November. In the late autumn season, she turns the lakes into a churning frenzy of wind and waves, with bone-chilling rain and piercing sleet or snow. The witch has taken many vessels down into the depths or stranded at the mercy of the storm. One of these ships was the steamer Mataafa. On November 28, 1905, the 430-foot ship attempted to make it to safe haven through the Duluth Canal when a wave sent her smashing into the North Pier, where her rudder was ripped off. The ship was at the full mercy of the waves and was grounded just 700 feet away from the shore. But the seas were so violent that any attempts at rescue were unsuccessful. It wasn't until the next morning that the crew could be rescued. By then, 15 of the crew had survived, but all 9 of those in the stern had perished. Many of their bodies were so encased in ice that axes had to be used just to get the ice off. In 1913, she would hit the lakes again, taking down 12 ships with her. But it wasn't until 1958 and 1966 that her 2 biggest victims would sink, the Carl D. Bradley and the Daniel J. Morrell. But now, the Edmund Fitzgerald was in her sights, the largest victim yet. Initially, the National Weather Service predicted the low-pressure storm that was currently in Kansas to pass south of Lake Superior, but it had started to move in a more northerly direction, which now had it set for the southeastern part of Lake Superior. The storm had also gained momentum as it moved through Kansas and into Iowa, and the National Weather Service posted a new bulletin calling for gale-force winds in all of Lake Superior of 34 to 38 knots. At around the same time, the 767-foot Arthur M. Anderson had just departed to Harbors, Minnesota at 4:30 p.m. As the vessel headed into the open lake, Captain Bernie Cooper could see the Fitzgerald in the distance. The Anderson was a 767-foot freighter built in 1952. The ship had originally been constructed with a length of 647 feet, but over the winter of 1974 to 1975, the vessel was lengthened by 120 feet. This increased her cargo capacity from 20,150 tons to 26,525 tons. Both the Anderson and the Fitzgerald were known to be hardworking vessels, and both were also weather reporting vessels. 4 times during the day, the vessels would measure the temperature, wind velocity, and wave height and report their findings to the National Weather Service. At the time, neither captains were very concerned about the weather, and both ships stayed on their course. But by early evening on November 9th, conditions started to deteriorate. The winds blew harder and the seas started to build. But this was nothing unusual for that time of the year when the change in jet streams brought strong storms to the region. Both McSorley and Cooper were fully confident in their vessels. They contacted each other about the predicted weather, but neither were very concerned and both stayed on their intended course. Throughout the evening on November 9th, the weather continued to worsen and waves started to build. At 1 o'clock a.m., on November 10th, the Edmund Fitzgerald was measuring winds of 52 knots, moving in a northeasterly direction, and 10-foot waves. Visibility was down to 2 to 4 miles. An hour later, the National Weather Service issued a new bulletin. Northeast winds 35 to 50 knots and waves of 8 to 15 feet. At this point, both vessels had encountered worse. So Bernie Cooper of the Anderson radioed McSorley to talk about changing their courses to avoid the brunt of the storm. Both would agree on the northern route, which would take them closer to the Canadian shore and provide some protection from the storm. The change in direction would mean a longer time on the lake, but as it was, the ship was nearing the end of the season, and some time lost wasn't a big deal. At 3 o'clock a.m., the Fitzgerald passed the Anderson, which up to that point had been ahead of the vessel. As the 2 vessels continued on, the Fitzgerald rolled and flexed in the heavy seas. All vessels in the lakes were built to flex to a certain extent to counter wave action, and the Fitz was no exception to this. But some crewmen would later testify that the ship would bend considerably in heavy weather, more so than other vessels, and have sort of a springing motion after the wave had passed. It seemed near the middle of the vessel, the Fitzgerald would shudder and stop only to do the same a couple seconds later. Richard Orgel, a crew member who had served on the Fitzgerald, had concerns for this and even mentioned it to McSorley. McSorley said sometimes it even concerned him. but the Fitzgerald sailed on without any issues. At 1 o'clock p.m., the skies cleared, and the Edmund Fitzgerald found herself sailing in fairly calm seas. The ship was in the eye of the storm. The vessel had turned south not too long before, and enjoyed calmer seas and less rough sailing. But when the eye of the storm passed, the ship would be sailing under the worst conditions yet. The winds would change direction, and as the storm itself passed, the ships would encounter even heavier seas. Ahead of the two vessels were two islands, Michipicoten Island to the east and Caribou Island to the west. Caribou Island presented a number of hazards, including rocky shoals around it. 600 feet of lake bed transformed into 36 feet in a very little distance. These shallow areas could be even more rough than the open water. Bernie Cooper would contact McSorley, saying he intended to change his course to put extra distance from his vessel and Michipicoten Island, anticipating that strong winds could knock his vessel off course and into dangerous waters. McSorley would remain on his present course, angling the vessel directly between the two islands. The sky then started darkening again, and snow started to fall. 12-foot waves started hitting the ship, sending spray over the deck. The winds were coming from the northwest now, and the Edmund Fitzgerald no longer had the protection of the Canadian shore. The waves could build across the entirety of the lake, transforming into massive walls of water. These waves would bounce off the Canadian shore and then come back the other way, while others would bounce off the Michigan shore and come back. This meant that the Edmund Fitzgerald would be battered by waves from 3 different directions. Additionally, these waves had less distance in between them. On the ocean, waves have a greater distance between them because of the sheer size of the ocean. This allows for larger waves, but means there is more distance between them. Since the Great Lakes are smaller, there is a shorter distance between these waves, and although the waves aren't as large, they can be more brutal. Vessels sailing in these storms are relentlessly battered by the seas. By mid-afternoon on November 10th, the Edmund Fitzgerald had passed by Michipicoten Island and was headed towards the smaller Caribou Island. The storm had intensified and visibility had decreased to the point of neither vessel being able to see one another other than on radar. The Big Fitz would be now in the most dangerous part of her journey, under conditions that deteriorated with every passing minute. Caribou Island is a small island surrounded by shoals. If the vessel was to hit these shoals, it would allow water to enter the vessel. One of those shoals just north of the island was the deadly reef known as the 6 Fathom Shoal. Here the lake bed rose from 600 feet to just 36 feet. But unbeknownst to those aboard the vessel, another area, even shallower than the 6 Fathom Shoal, with a depth of just 31 feet, was uncharted. It seemed that the famed vessel was headed right for it. Sometime after 3 in the afternoon, the Arthur M. Anderson, 15 miles behind the Fitzgerald, observed the ship on radar as she passed by Caribou Island. Captain Bernie Cooper remarked to his first mate Morgan Clark about how close the vessel was to the 6 Fathom Shoal, saying it was closer than he wanted his ship to be. Only minutes after observing the Edmund Fitzgerald's close proximity to the shoals, the Anderson received a call from the vessel at 3:35 p.m. Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have sustained topside damage. I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I am checking down. Will you stay by me until I get to Whitefish? Charlie on that, Fitzgerald. Do you have your pumps going? Yes, both of them. A list indicated that water had entered the vessel, but the ship had 2 main electric pumps, which could pump out 7,000 gallons a minute, and an additional 2 auxiliary pumps, which could pump out 2,000 gallons a minute. By now, the Fitzgerald was about 5 miles east of Caribou Island, and winds were blowing at more than 60 miles an hour, with waves of 8 to 15 feet. The Soo locks had closed after wind gusts of 90 miles an hour made the locks unusable. The 2 vessels would now have their eyes set on Whitefish Bay, a safe haven at the southernmost part of Lake Superior. The bay provided some protection from the waves and winds ravaging the rest of the lake. If the 2 ships could make it there, they would be able to wait out the rest of the storm. At 4:10 p.m., McSorley radioed the Anderson. Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I've lost both radars. Can you assist me in navigation till we reach Whitefish Bay? First Mate Morgan Clark agreed. With both radars out, the Fitzgerald would be sailing blind. The crew would have no way of knowing if they were off course without assistance from the Anderson. But things were only getting worse for the battered vessel. The Whitefish Point lighthouse was out. The crew now didn't have any visual point of reference as to the location of Whitefish Bay. By 4:30 p.m., darkness had set in, and the winds were blowing at 65 miles an hour, and seas were reaching over 16 feet. The Fitz had used a radar direction finder to try and locate the Whitefish Point lighthouse, but was unable to locate it. McSorley then radioed the Grand Marais Coast Guard station, asking about the lighthouse's status. The station wasn't sure and didn't have the equipment there to tell whether or not it was, so they said they'd get back to him. But McSorley didn't want to wait, so shortly after he sent a call to, quote, anyone in the vicinity of Whitefish Point. Cedric Woodard, the captain of the 490-foot Swedish vessel Ava Fors, answered his call. The Ava Fors was just leaving Whitefish Point. Woodard could see the outline of the lighthouse and informed his caller that it was not operating. "Who is this?" he asked. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar to him. "This is Captain McSorley." Woodard was shocked. He had known McSorley for 15 years and talked with him often, but this wasn't his voice. In fact, it sounded nothing like Captain McSorley. But things would only get more odd from here. In the middle of their conversation, McSorley could be heard shouting, "Don't allow nobody on deck," and something else that he couldn't distinguish. McSorley then thanked Woodard and ended the call. Shortly after, the Coast Guard station at Grand Marais contacted the Fitzgerald and informed the captain that the lighthouse suffered a power outage, but crews were working to restore the signal. At this point, the Edmund Fitzgerald was in bad condition. The ship was gradually sinking lower in the water, with her list to starboard increasing. Waves were now sending tons of green water over her spar deck. Green water is solid water rather than spray on a vessel's deck. The water can sit on top of the vessel's spar deck, weighing down the vessel and putting immense force on the hatch covers, which if collapsed would send water pouring into the vessel's cargo hold. At 5:45 p.m., the Ava Fors contacted the Fitzgerald again. "Fitzgerald, this is the Ava Fors. I have the Whitefish light now, but I'm still receiving no signal." "I'm very glad to hear it," McSorley responded. "It's really howling down here. What are the conditions up where you are?" Woodard asked. "We are taking heavy seas over our decks. It's the worst sea I've ever been in. We have a bad list and no radar." "Are they both out?" "Yes, both of them." The news about the light at Whitefish Point would be short-lived. After operating for a short time, the light went out again. At around 6:30 p.m., the waves were at 20 to 30 feet, and the wind was blowing at more than 60 miles an hour, with some gusts reaching more than 100 miles per hour. The ships were sailing in hurricane-force winds. It was at this time that the Anderson encountered two monstrous 35-foot rogue waves. The first made its way on the deck and continued down the length of it, before crashing into the pilot house and sending the bow into the water. After righting herself, the Anderson was hit with another wave, sending the bow under again and putting green water on the bridge deck that remained there longer than the first. These two waves were now headed for the Edmund Fitzgerald. At 7:00 p.m., Morgan Clark would update the vessel about her position as she was heading slightly off course. At 7:10 p.m., First Mate Morgan Clark of the Anderson again called the Fitzgerald. "There is a target 19 miles to the head. You are ahead of us, so the target is 9 miles ahead." "Well, am I going to clear?" asking about the vessel ahead of her. "Yes, he's going to pass west of you." "Well, fine," McSorley responded. "Oh, by the way, how are you making out with your problems?" Clark asked. "We are holding our own." "Okay, fine. I will be talking to you later." First Mate Morgan Clark had no way of knowing that those were the last words anyone would ever hear from a soul aboard the Fitzgerald. In a wave of interference, the radar signal became distorted and then turned into a white blob that the Fitzgerald disappeared into. When the radar screen finally cleared, the vessel was gone. She was only 17 miles away from the safety of Whitefish Bay. There was no distress call, no cries for help. The Edmund Fitzgerald and her crew of 29 had just disappeared. At around 7:30 p.m., visibility started to clear, but the Edmund Fitzgerald was nowhere to be seen. Bernie Cooper, who hadn't been in the pilot house when Clark had contacted the vessel, couldn't see the ship anywhere. He could see the light of 3 saltwater vessels, the upbound Manfrey, Ava Fors, and Benfrey, but not the Fitzgerald. With the snowstorm calming and the increased visibility, the Anderson should have been able to see the vessel, but they could see nothing. So Cooper and Clark grabbed binoculars, hoping that the vessel might have suffered a power outage and they could see the outline of the vessel. But again, they saw nothing. Once in a while, it looked like there was a signal on radar, but it would disappear just as quickly as it appeared. Captain Cooper tried to radio the Fitzgerald, but got nothing back but dead air and static. So Cooper called another ship in the vicinity. The call didn't go through either. So Bernie Cooper assumed that the Anderson signal wasn't being picked up, but after another call, he got an immediate response from the 647-foot William Clay Ford, anchored in Whitefish Bay. He asked the captain if he had seen the Fitzgerald. Captain Don Erickson said he hadn't. Cooper called other vessels in the area, and all said the same. The Edmund Fitzgerald was nowhere to be seen. At 7:39 p.m., the Anderson called Channel 16, the distress signal to contact the U.S. Coast Guard at Sault Ste. Marie. He was told to call back on Channel 12, as they were trying to locate a missing 16-foot boat and wanted to keep the channel clear. When Cooper called on Channel 12, his call wouldn't get through. Almost an hour later, at 8:32 p.m., the Anderson would finally get in contact with the Coast Guard. Captain Cooper would then state his concerns over the vessel, but they were received with little concern. No one thought that a vessel as modern and as safe as the Edmund Fitzgerald could sink. It wouldn't be until the fourth call at 9:03 p.m., when the Arthur M. Anderson had arrived safely at Whitefish Bay, that they launched the search and rescue operation. The Coast Guard Air Station at Traverse City would dispatch rescue aircraft, and at 9:25 p.m., the 110-foot harbor tug, Naugatuck, would depart Sault Ste. Marie. But after only minutes of sailing, the tug would have to turn around, as she could only handle winds of up to 60 knots. This meant that the only Coast Guard vessel capable of handling the weather was the 180-foot buoy tender, Woodrush, which was 300 miles away in Duluth, Minnesota. Despite that, the vessel was still ordered to make her way to the search site and left at 9:30 p.m. At 10:06 p.m., the first rescue aircraft arrived on the scene, and shortly after, 2 helicopters were dispatched from the air station at Traverse City, Michigan. At this point, with concerns over the Fitzgerald and the possibility of her crew being in need of rescue, the Coast Guard called the vessels in Whitefish Bay to ask if anyone would go out and look for the vessel. When they called the Anderson, Captain Cooper straight out refused, saying that they already had one on the bottom, and if he went out, that could be 2. All of the other vessels had also refused. No one was willing to risk going out again. Captain Cooper had talked to Erickson of the William Clay Ford, and he was staying put too. It was just too dangerous. But the Coast Guard would keep trying, and by now, Cooper had started to become troubled by the thought of possible survivors needing their help.
Roger, we have it. Do you think there's any possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Over. Oh, God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large. If you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way. If you think you can safely go back into the area, I would request that you do so, but I have to leave that decision up to you. I'll go out and take a look, but I know when I was about 15 miles above Whitefish, we took a sea right over the top of the hatch crane up here, and that's 8 feet up in the water too, so I don't know whether I can do it or not. I'll give it a try, but that's all I can do.
When the chief engineer told the crew they were going back out, one of the crewmen recorded his last will, sealed it in wax, and put it in a jar. The Coast Guard would try to enlist other vessels to join the search and rescue operation, but only 2 others would join: the William Clay Ford and the 730-foot Canadian bulk carrier, Hilda Marianne. The 3 ships would be risking the lives of their crew to go back into the storm and look for the survivors. All 3 captains knew that even if they were to find survivors, that would only be the beginning of an extremely difficult operation. It wasn't as simple as just picking them out of the water and rescuing them. With the conditions as they were, rescue was nearly impossible. This wasn't an easy, quick decision for any of the 3 captains either, and all had refused on being asked the first time. Erickson had even told his 3rd mate to tell the Coast Guard no if they called, but after going to his room, he was also troubled by the thought of somebody needing their help. If they weren't to go now, and there was a crewman still alive from the Fitzgerald, they wouldn't have much time until hypothermia set in. So Erickson told the mate to say yes if they called. He would even call Bernie Cooper, who at the time had not yet agreed to go out, and said he was thinking about it. Cooper had said the same, and said he'd go out if the Ford went out. Now, the vessels were battling the waves again, headed for where the Fitzgerald was last known to be. The Coast Guard, hoping to get more vessels involved in the search, contacted the 3 saltwater vessels that were headed upbound if they would be willing to join the search. But as it was, all of them had already regretted going out in the first place and noted that turning around would put their vessels in extreme danger. The Nanfree would agree to reduce her speed and turn slightly to the north to see if they saw anything, but that was it. It was just the 3 vessels headed for the search area. But only 30 minutes after leaving, the seas proved to be too much for the Hilda Marianne, and the captain was forced to turn the vessel around. So the Arthur M. Anderson and the William Clay Ford would continue on in a parallel course for the last known location of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It was 2 a.m. on November 11th when the Anderson arrived on the scene, followed shortly after by the William Clay Ford. The Coast Guard's HU-16 and HH-52 helicopter had already been searching the area and had seen nothing. They had fired flares, and the HH-52 had searched the water with a 3.8 million candle power searchlight, but there was nothing but waves. Around 3 a.m., several other vessels headed downbound had adjusted their speed and course in response to the call. More aircraft also arrived on the scene in the following hours, but still, there was nothing. If the famed vessel had gone down, it was extremely odd that nothing, not even any sign of the wreckage, had showed up. By sunrise, the William Clay Ford had left the search, but the Arthur M. Anderson continued on. At 8:07 a.m., Cooper's fears were confirmed. The Fitzgerald's No. 1 lifeboat was discovered, with only the forward 16 feet of it still intact. The stern of the boat was gone. A half an hour later, the second lifeboat was discovered, mangled but still intact. As they continued searching, they would also find life rafts, life preservers, gas tanks, oars, canisters, but no sign of anyone from the vessel. The condition of the life rafts and life preservers also seemed to indicate none of them had ever been used. By the afternoon of the 11th, the Anderson left the search and headed toward the Sioux Locks. Subsequently, over the next couple of days, more wreckage would be found, but no bodies would be discovered. By 10:13 p.m. on November 13th, the search was called off. On November 14th, a Navy Orion used a magnetic anomaly detection unit to try and find the vessel. About 17 miles from Whitefish Bay, it picked up 2 large underwater objects. It would send the coordinates to the Woodrush, and on November 16th, the vessel would scan the area through use of a side-scan sonar. This proved to be difficult as another storm was brewing. Despite this, the Woodrush was able to find what the Orion had located. Under 530 feet of water were 2 large presences on the lake bed. The Woodrush would crisscross the area for the next 2 days. The 2 parts of the wreck both measured around 300 feet in length, with a sonically rough area in between that could account for the vessel's cargo. The Woodrush would return again on November 22nd through the 25th to gather more information. No one could be certain, though, that the wreck was the Fitzgerald until it was visited. But with winter setting in, that would have to wait. So finally, the next spring, on May 20th, 1976, the Curve 3, a remotely operated underwater recovery vehicle that could record video and images, was sent down to the wreck. As it lowered and finally reached the bottom, it came across a deep gouge in the lake bed. It was almost as if the Curve 3 was on another planet. Then, out of the darkness, a large object made out of steel came into sight. Then, the crew in the Woodrush saw letters. As they got closer, they realized they were reading the name, Edmund Fitzgerald, and Milwaukee, upside down. They had found it. The Curve 3 would make 12 more dives from the 20th of May to the 28th and captured 43,255 feet of television footage and 895 still photos. In the days and months following the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, there was still a mess of legal action, investigations, and news reports. Everybody was looking for someone to blame. The Coast Guard was also criticized for its response and lack of capable rescue vessels. The Marine Board would start its investigation on November 18, 1975, and from then until December 13th, the board would hear many testimonies, study 361 exhibits, and generate around 3,000 pages of documents. Countless sailors would testify, including Bernie Cooper, who was questioned for the call he made on November 11th to U.S. Steel, in which he stated how he thought that the Edmund Fitzgerald was too close to the 6-fathom spot and might have bottomed out. When he was asked about it, he backed off from what he had said earlier, heeding the advice from his lawyers from U.S. Steel. When they played back the recording of his call to U.S. Steel, he would respond, quote, "You are talking about a conversation I had when I had been up 48 hours and tired," end quote. The board would also hear from crew who had previously sailed on the Fitz, crew from the Anderson, and other experts, but none of these would give definite answers as to how or why the Edmund Fitzgerald had went down. There was one thing certain, though. Nobody could be sure about what happened until they visited the wreck, and once they did, a wave of theories and controversy would begin. When the Marine Board's report came out on July 26, 1977, it was hotly disputed. Another report a year later from the NTSB would yield similar results. Mariners, experts, and enthusiasts would all come up with their theories as to the vessel's final moments, but even still, there was no surety. Yet there are still several main theories as to how the Edmund Fitzgerald sank, which I will expand upon and compare. The first theory was issued by the Marine Board. This theory concluded that the Fitzgerald's hatches were ineffectively closed and allowed water to enter the cargo hold, sinking the vessel lower into the water. When the seas boarded the spar deck, the water was likely concentrated forward. A wave then pushed the bow under, which never recovered, and struck the bottom. The splitting of the vessel would have occurred while the bow was hitting the bottom. The Marine Board defended this theory by pointing to the vessel being allowed more freeboard in 1973, the inspection on October 31st finding damage to the hatch combings, along with other wear and tear that the, quote, required maintenance was not performed on, end quote. The vessel being allowed to carry more cargo put it lower in the water, which allowed more spray and green water over the spar deck, which in turn allowed more water to enter the cargo hold through ineffective hatch closure. They also pointed to the underwater survey of the vessel that showed only a couple of the hatch clamps, which fastened the hatch cover in place, were damaged. This meant, in all likelihood, that only those damaged were properly fastened, and the rest weren't, allowing water to enter the holds. Also, the vessel's cargo hold was fitted with screen bulkheads that weren't watertight, meaning water could have flowed freely throughout the vessel's 3 holds. Additionally, the Fitzgerald was not equipped with sounding tubes or any means of detecting water in the holds. The crew would have no idea if there was water in the cargo hold. In regards to the list and topside damage, the Marine Board concluded that the lost vents allowed water to enter the ballast tank and produce a list. It also said that the damage to the vents and fence rail was caused by a floating object being brought aboard by the waves, which knocked the fence rail down and damaged the vents. C.S. Loosemore would later test the theory and find that if about 1/3 of the hatches was allowing water into the vessel, the ship would have lost 5 or 6 feet of freeboard by the time it turned south. This was concurrent with the reports. Interestingly, the Fitzgerald also reported bigger waves than anyone else, also indicating that the vessel had lost freeboard. But the NTSB would report a slightly different story. After 3:30 p.m., there was flooding in at least one of the ballast tanks in the tunnel, which caused the starboard list. While this was happening, water was entering through non-weathertight hatch covers. The green water on deck would have been trapped by the shear strake, extending 15 3/8 inches above the weather deck. The combination of water in the ballast tanks, the tunnel, the cargo hold, and on deck would have continually decreased the freeboard of the vessel, pushing her lower in the water. According to the NTSB's calculations, by 7:15 p.m., enough water would have entered the hull for her freeboard to drop to 0. With wave heights of 25 feet, this would cause a static head of 12.5 feet, which was more than enough to cause hatch cover failure. The seas would have caused a piling effect at the area behind the forward deck house. The result was a domino effect of hatch covers failing that sent the bow smashing into the lake bed, the middle section disintegrating upon impact, and the stern rolling over. Hatch cover failure would have allowed massive flooding of the vessel's cargo hold, which progressed throughout the entirety of the cargo hold's 3 sections, as the screen bulkheads were not watertight. With waves coming from the back, the water would have been pushed to the bow, sending it under. The NTSB would also blame the loss of the fence rail and vents on a floating object boarding the spar deck or the hatch crane coming loose and striking them. The board would discredit the theory of bottoming out, saying the vessel's probable track line wasn't anywhere near the shoals. They calculated the Edmund Fitzgerald's most probable track line through use of radar information through testimony, routine log entries, the course of the vessels, and speed. The probable track line focused on the time frame of 12:52 p.m. to 7:15 p.m. on the 10th of November. The normal track line through Michipicoten Island and Caribou Island is 141 degrees. The reported position of the Edmund Fitzgerald from 1:59 p.m. to 3:20 p.m. was 144 degrees, and her position from 3:20 p.m. to 7:15 p.m. was 139 degrees. These positions placed the Fitzgerald 5 miles west of the 6-fathom spot and 3.3 miles from the nearest point of possible grounding or bottoming out. Even if the Edmund Fitzgerald departed from her position at 3:20 p.m., the vessel would have had to change her course by 64 degrees and increase her speed to 19.8 miles per hour. The ship's maximum speed was 16.3. The NTSB also calculated that even with the survey of the area after the sinking finding a shoal extending a mile further, the Fitzgerald would have still been well clear of it. Even more convincing was what they found out from the wreck. The stern section of the vessel was found without any cracks to indicate bottoming out. Even with the evidence, many would still disagree with the board's findings. Perhaps the most popular theory is that of Captain Bernie Cooper, the Lake Carriers Association, and the dissenting opinion of board member Philip Hogue. In this theory, the vessel does bottom out at the 6-fathom spot. The water then entered the ballast tanks or cargo hold, or both, and caused a starboard list. The bottoming out also caused the loss of 2 vent tanks and the fence rail. In the fury of the storm and the sound of the wind, the crew would have no idea that the vessel bottomed out. It would have drowned out the sound. The ship would have gradually been sinking from that point on. Then, most likely, the 2 seas that the Anderson experienced would have caught up with the Fitzgerald and sent the bow under the water, where it would never recover. The ship then broke apart underwater from the impact of the bow hitting the lake bed and came to rest in its position on the bottom of the lake. In defense of the theory, it was stated that McSorley always made sure the Fitz was watertight in heavy weather. The hatch covers could not have been the issue then. It was also argued that modern hatch covers and clamps were more safe than years past, and that it was wrong to just assume the crew's negligence in securing the hatches in heavy weather. Additionally, the theory of water entering the hold over a long period of time was unlikely, as the Fitzgerald experienced the worst weather during the last part of her journey. This theory also pointed to the fact that most of the other theories didn't give much significance to the loss of 2 vent tanks and the fence rail. A fence rail doesn't just come down in a storm. A significant change of force needs to occur for that to happen. Bottoming out can cause that extreme change in force. A fence rail doesn't come down from just waves. In Bernie Cooper's most fresh report of the accident, he had reported observing the Fitzgerald going over the 6-fathom spot. He even relayed this to U.S. Steel after the search. It's also important to note that Bernie Cooper was under pressure from U.S. Steel to not expand upon these feelings more so. In addition to this, a year after the wreck, the Canadian Hydrographic Service surveyed the area and found that the 6-fathom shoal extended a mile further out. In this area, the depth was just 31 feet. Bernie Cooper would stand by this theory until his death in 1993. The last theory, and most unpopular, is that the Edmund Fitzgerald broke apart on the surface like the Carl D. Bradley or Daniel J. Morrell. In this theory, the crew knew the Fitzgerald was sinking and tried to get off the vessel. They used the pilothouse door being opened as evidence, along with a body eventually being found with a life jacket on. The wreck was also in 2 separate parts. Most, however, would discredit that theory. In going over all the evidence, the NTSB's theory and Bernie Cooper's theory would be most likely of all. Insufficient closure of the hatch covers when gales are predicted is unlikely, as crews will often be instructed to use all the clamps. McSorley was also known to make sure his crew fastened all the clamps when gales were predicted. The ship also only experienced the worst weather for a short period of time. In the NTSB's theory, a large object was the cause for the loss of the fence rail. This seems more unlikely than the vessel bottoming out. There is a strong argument against bottoming out, though, as like I stated previously, there was no indication on the stern section that the vessel had bottomed out. If the Fitzgerald did bottom out, there would likely be a crack to indicate that. However, the entire middle section of the vessel was disintegrated, which could have held evidence of a possible bottoming out on the shoals. In response to the theory of bottoming out, if the shoals penetrated the cargo hold, the vessel would have sunk quickly as a result. However, it's possible that the shoals could have only penetrated the ballast tank, where the vessel's 2 pumps would have pumped out water, but because the amount of water entering the tank was more than what the vessel could pump back out, the pumps would have only delayed the inevitable sinking or full loss of freeboard. As for the last theory of breaking apart on the surface, the 30-foot deep gash in the lake bed and condition of the Fitzgerald wrecked bow indicates that it hit the lake bed with considerable force, which would be nearly impossible if the Fitzgerald broke apart on the surface. But even with all the theories and evidence and guesswork, the only people who knew the fate of the famed vessel perished with her. The fate of the Edmund Fitzgerald will likely forever be a mystery. In the years following the wreck, there would be many more visits to it by divers and remote-controlled vehicles. One of the most famous of these visits would be from Jacques Cousteau's Calypso. Jacques Cousteau himself was not on board during the visit, but instead had his son conduct the visit. Another visit to the wreck would discover the badly decomposed body of a crew member near the bow section. As for the condition of the wreck itself, the Edmund Fitzgerald is quite mangled. A sad and beaten version of the ship she once was. Most of the bow section is buried into the lake bed. At the bow there are gaping holes, and at the end of the bow section there is significant tearing of steel. The bow section of the wreck measures 276 feet in length. The stern section is upside down and measures 253 feet in length. The middle section is just gone. On July 4th, 1995, the HMSC Cormorant took friends and family of the Fitzgerald's crew to the wreck site. Deep-sea diver Bruce Foucault would descend to the wreck with a newt suit and use a special underwater torch to cut out the Fitzgerald's bell. Once the bell was cut off, it was raised to the surface by a tow line from the tug Angling Lady and retrieved by Jacques Champeau on board the Cormorant. The next day, another bell engraved with the names of the 29 men who perished was put in its place. The raising of the bell would put a type of finality to the wreck, something that could bring their loved ones close once more. On November 10th, 1995, the bell was placed in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point as a permanent exhibit. Later on July 17th, 1999, after years of the families battling to make the wreck off limits, the Edmund Fitzgerald was consecrated as a gravesite. The Coast Guard cutter Mackinac stationed above the Edmund Fitzgerald with friends and families of the lost crewmen and held the ceremony and consecration of the wreck. The 29 men could finally rest in peace.